Where exactly should a defensive midfielder stand? And where should they pass? You probably feel like build-up starts from the defensive midfield area. But when the pressure comes, it feels like you can't do anything, right? Or maybe you think midfield is just a position for ex-players only. Today, I prepared this defensive midfielder content in serious detail. If you watch this video all the way through, at least the way you think about playing as a defensive midfielder will start to look like a trained #6. 1. The role of a defensive midfielder. When I say defensive midfielder, I'm talking about the position that is also called a double pivot, holding midfielder, or central midfielder. To put it simply, this is the player who protects the defensive line in the defensive phase and becomes the starting point of the build-up structure. 1. The core of build-up. A defensive midfielder must have good kicking, ball-keeping ability, and the ability to play out of pressure. In reality, this is a player who has a major influence not only on the result of the match, but also on the overall feel of the game, especially the possession. If the ball cannot be distributed stably from this position, it can give the impression that the team is being pushed back overall. If you have an exceptional attacker among your forwards, and he scores a lot of goals, you may still win on the scoreboard. But if you lose the battle in defensive midfield, you will inevitably lose the game's momentum and atmosphere. 2. The core of box-to-box. That means you have to keep running from our penalty box to the opponent's penalty box. In the end, you need to have good stamina. Whether attacking or defending, you need to help in the numbers battle. And when defending, you especially need to protect the defensive line. Protecting the defensive line means, first of all, helping so that the opposing attacker on the ball does not end up directly facing our center backs. In team sports, there is no advantage greater than numerical superiority. This is a player who has to keep being involved in that numbers battle. In the end, this is a position where both technique and stamina need to be good, but in amateur football, it is really hard to find a player who is good at both. 2. Movement of a defensive midfielder. 1. Opponent attacking. We have not yet set our defensive shape. In a situation where the opponent is counterattacking, what is the one thing that every position should prioritize the most? Yes, that's right, delay. This is something like common sense that, of course, every player should always have in mind. If you think about it carefully, an opponent's counterattack comes right after we lose the ball. And in football, the best time to win the ball back after losing possession is roughly the first 5 seconds right after losing it. The reason is that while our team has possession, the opponent is in a defensive shape and is still likely to be compact in a small area. Therefore, before the opponent spreads out and launches a full counterattack, in other words, as a defensive midfielder, defending aggressively from a higher position helps cut off the opponent's counterattack at the source. Even if winning the ball back looks impossible, pressing with everything you have immediately after losing it can still force a mistake from the opponent and give your teammate a better chance to win the ball. Winning the ball yourself can be what makes you a defensive midfielder, but creating the chance for someone else to win it can also be what makes you a defensive midfielder. But this is much easier said than done, and physically it is very demanding. That is why playing defensive midfield is hard. You have to be able to strike the ball well, and you also have to run a lot. 2. Opponent attacking. We have set our defensive shape. As explained earlier, the meaning of protecting the back four is the role of blocking the opponent's attacker so that he cannot freely make runs or take shots in front of the center backs. If the defensive line, especially the center backs, ends up directly facing the opposing attacker, one dribble or one dray can lead to conceding a goal. So it is very important to prevent the opposing attacker from directly facing our center backs in a comfortable situation. That is what protecting the back four means. This sounds easy, but once you are actually in the game, you have to keep moving from the opponent's penalty box all the way to our penalty box, so the physical burden is quite heavy. That is because in football, there is no stronger weapon than numerical superiority. So even if it is hard, simply running a lot so that our team can have numerical superiority can itself be a big role. Let's say on your team there is a defensive midfielder who is excellent in every aspect, such as ball control, keeping, and passing, but cannot run much, so he cannot properly protect the back four defensively. And on the other hand, let's say there is a defensive midfielder who is a little less technical, but runs a lot and protects the back four very well. Then who should you use as the defensive midfielder? The answer is that the higher the overall level of the team, the more they use the technically superior player, because the higher the overall level of the team, the more dramatically high their possession of the ball is. And high possession means there is simply less need to run around defending. That is the reality of amateur football. But if someone is technically excellent and also runs a lot while protecting the back four, we call those people players. During a game, if the opponent has crossed the halfway line and is dribbling comfortably, and it is a position where it is awkward for anyone else to step in, then the defensive midfielder must go no matter what. 3. Our attack. The opponent has not yet set their defensive shape. This is our counterattack situation. If I explain the priority of passing lanes in this moment, the defensive midfielder should first look for the player who is in a position to immediately attack the space behind the opponent's defense with one pass. That could be our forward, or it could be our winger. But the important thing is that, in terms of probability, it is better for the ball to go toward the opposite side from the direction the opponent was attacking. This is not an absolute answer in every case, but in a situation where the opponent has not yet set their defensive shape, delivering the ball to the side opposite from where they were attacking naturally means there will be fewer defenders there. So in a counterattack situation, there is a high chance that the passing lane should go toward the side. The second passing lane is to play the ball into our attacking midfielder or forward in the middle. The reason the central area is not the first option but the second is because there are always many defenders in the central area. So when the ball is played into the forward, it is good if the forward can turn and finish the situation, but if that is difficult, it is better to move to receive a return pass from the forward, and then play a non-stop pass from that return ball into the space behind the defense. Because you have to launch the counterattack in 1 or 2 passes, the timing of the pass is everything. So if you cannot make good use of the attack within 3 passes, you should consider the counterattack chance almost over. In amateur football, up to 5 passes is okay. To carry out this kind of counterattack, you need to be good at long kicks, and it is important to already know the positions of our attackers in advance. Especially in counterattack situations, a third-man pass where you receive a return pass from the forward is often very useful. In Korean amateur football, a third-man pass means that first a second-line player passes to a first-line player, then the second-line player receives the return pass and opens it to another third player positioned on the first line. The reason this pass is useful is, first, because it is done non-stop, so the timing is fast and it is not easy to predict. And second, when the first pass is played to the first-line player, the defender's positions and attention tend to focus on that first-line attacker, so it can destabilize the opponent's defense. 4. Our attack. The opponent has set their defensive shape. When the opponent has set their defensive shape, if you force the attacking direction only to one side, it becomes easy to get blocked. So the defensive midfielder has to circulate the ball left and right from deeper areas to disturb the balance of the defensive line. If you can move the ball quickly at this time, you can break the opponent's pressing timing and create open space. When the opponent's defense is set like this, the priority of passing lanes is first to keep exchanging short passes continuously with our fellow midfielders or with the players on the sides. So when 2 or 3 short passes have pulled the opponent's players in like a magnet, you should either open it to the opposite side in one sudden action like lightning, or play the ball into the central forward. The midfield position itself, unlike the wide areas or the attacking and defensive positions, is open in all directions, so the freedom of passing is very high. So in truth, it is difficult to define the priority of passing lanes. But the most important thing is not to let the ball stop. That is the most important thing. Also, if the opponent does not get drawn out easily, then you have to use build-up from the back to draw them out, and then play a forward pass by finding the brief gap that appears in the opponent's line. And even in this kind of situation, if the opponent clears the ball, this is generally the position that should win that ball first. If you fail to win that second ball at that moment, it leads to the opponent's counterattack. So you always have to think with a mindset of being prepared for the counterattack. Personally, I think this may be the biggest difference from an attacking midfielder. That is because an attacking midfielder plays in a slightly higher position and has a slightly lower share of defensive involvement. 3. Things a defensive midfielder must never do. 1. Killer pass syndrome. Killer pass syndrome is a type of defensive midfielder that you really see very often. In order to play a killer pass, the mistake that defensive midfielders in ordinary amateur football easily make is dribbling by themselves while looking for our teammate, making a run into the space behind the defense. This happens very, very often. In extreme cases, I have seen many defensive midfielders who dribble and keep the ball by themselves while running left and right, and if the attackers do not make runs the way they want, they get angry and simply give up on the game. Why is this kind of play a problem? First of all, from the opponent's point of view, it is too easy to stop. Naturally, when one player is dribbling, looking, and then passing, it is easy to predict. Then how can you play killer passes? As you are seeing now, you need to exchange a lot of passes that look like meaningless passes. In other words, passes to teammates in front of you or next to you. In reality, passing to a player who is not under any pressure at all, and then receiving the ball back may not seem very meaningful. But if you exchange passes like this, the position of the ball changes. So first of all, the position of the defense changes. And second, the opposing team's line of sight becomes confused. And most importantly, if a non-stop pass comes out from those exchanged passes, it becomes hard to predict. The biggest difference between former football players and ordinary amateurs is in this part. When you first play with former players, this pattern is the one that causes the biggest mental breakdown. Also, because you need a third player who can predict this non-stop pass and run for it, this part is admittedly a little difficult. That is why there is a big difference here between a team with 2 to 3 former players and a team with 4 to 5 or more former players. A team with 4 to 5 former players has many more third players who can predict and start their run. To summarize, curing killer pass syndrome is simple. Do not dribble while forcing a killer pass, and instead exchange many passes that seem meaningless. Shake the defense's movement and line of sight, and understand that non-stop passing is hard to predict. But of course, making mistakes while exchanging passes is amateur football. 2. Dribbling for a breakthrough. What is the fastest thing in football? The fastest thing in football, of course, is the ball traveling after a pass or a shot. Second is a person running without the ball. Third is a player dribbling in a straight line with the ball. And finally, the slowest is a player dribbling while using feints in order to beat a defender. The reason I suddenly ask this question is because the role of the defensive midfielder is largely to carry and distribute the ball from the defensive area to the attacking area. And in that role, the most important lifeblood is timing and speed. You understand what I am trying to say, right? A defensive midfielder, who becomes the main flow of the ball in our team's attacking build-up, should avoid dribbling for the purpose of beating a defender as much as possible. Because that action itself delays the speed of the attack. It does not help the team. Occasionally, it can be an exception if there is no teammate positioned in the direction where the ball should go, or in the direction that should be opened. Especially, that kind of case happens a lot in beginner-level amateur matches. Even so, in the midfield area, especially in the defensive midfield area, it is better to refrain from dribbling for the purpose of beating a defender itself. Dribbling to change the direction of attack, dribbling to protect the ball, or dribbling to create an angle because our teammates are positioned at angles where they cannot receive a pass are exceptions. I am preparing more detailed content on this part. I am planning a video where you can practice dribbling and movements by pattern for each position. 3. Not running and letting the spacing get stretched. This is really the most basic of the basics for a midfielder. I would even go so far as to say that football, in the end, is a game of securing numerical superiority. When it becomes 2 versus 1 football, becomes a game you can never win. The same is true for 3 versus 2 and 4 versus 3. Having one more player means you are in an absolutely superior position by that much. Even if you know this fact, in real football, especially in amateur football, as the game goes on, there are many cases where defenders stay only in the defensive area and attackers stay only in the attacking area, so the spacing becomes stretched, and even the midfielders cannot cover all of the space in between. It would be nice if the spacing always stayed consistent, but that is an ideal story. Now, realistically, let's assume both teams are exhausted. We have a back 4 in our defensive area, and the opponent has 3 attackers. At that moment, if 2 of the opponent's midfielders join the attack with everything they have, but our midfielders fail to track back, then it becomes a 5 versus 4 situation. In that case, we are absolutely at a disadvantage. At that point, a midfielder's football sense is still important, but whether or not the midfielder has the stamina to keep moving into positions where he can continue to be involved around the ball becomes the key that decides the game. Are professionals different? In my opinion, even at the professional level, because it is still competition among themselves, although not as much as amateurs, you still see the spacing stretch more as the game goes into the later stages. And the higher the level of the match, the more I think it ultimately becomes a battle of mentality and stamina. Because it is already a match between players whose tactics and techniques have reached a completed level. 4. Mindless passing. Among midfielders, there are players who get completely overrun in the midfield battle and just start hitting mindless kicks or passes. Of course, players like that should be moved to another position in the next game. But in real amateur football, that happens a lot. Of course, depending on the match situation, there are times when clearing the ball is necessary. But regardless of the other back four players, the team's defensive midfielder must not do that, because the defensive midfielder is exactly the ace who decides the team's attacking direction and controls the build-up. If you do not have that level of responsibility and ability, you should not play defensive midfielder. Even if a bad pass comes from the defensive area, you have to try to protect the ball well and connect it into a good pass toward the attacking area. Even if it is not easy, you still have to do that. Just because the game is being completely pushed against your team, the defensive midfielder must not become afraid to receive the ball or just kick it away without thinking. 5. Not opening up. Sometimes among midfielders in amateur football, there are midfielders who cannot play an open pass at all, and who are often called, so to speak, a midfielder who puts the ball back into the hole it came out of. At the professional level, players are fast and the ball is fast, so even if they look to open it, the defenders have often already set their shape. So there are cases where they fake an opening with one more deceiving action and then put it back again in the direction the ball came from. But in amateur football, in almost 100 out of 100 cases, playing it to the opposite side can be the better decision. The biggest characteristic of a midfielder who puts the ball back into the hole it came out of is that when the ball comes from the side, in most cases he plays a 1-2 pass. Of course, there are times when a 1-2 pass is good, but in most cases, shaking the attacking direction left and right is effective in breaking the opponent's defensive organization and draining the opponent's stamina. What I am talking about right now is automatic 1-2 passes. When the ball comes during build-up, the number one thing a defensive midfielder should think about first is switching it to the opposite side while considering the direction with fewer defenders and the direction where the attack has a higher chance of success. There is such a big difference in ability that they are not even comparable between a midfielder who tries to do the number one option but cannot switch because the situation does not allow it, and a midfielder who is not even thinking about the opposite side switch at all. For example, our attacker gets the ball on one side, and the opponent's defenders start pressing hard toward that side. Then sometimes the ball gets laid back to the midfielder. But when that happens, there are cases where the midfielder thoughtlessly puts it right back into that same side again. But if the opponent presses to one side and I receive the ball, then that should be 100% just switch it to the opposite side. Then the opposite side will definitely have space open. 6. Grenade passes. In midfield, the ball can be played in every direction, whether left, right, or central, so there are many options. So there can be many options, such as option 1, option 2, option 3, and so on. And the grenade pass I am about to talk about means a situation where, while hesitating between options 1, 2, and 3 in the end, even option 1, which was originally the safest option, has become risky. So it ends up looking like you are passing it right before the bomb explodes, like in a hot potato game. If you had passed it just 1 to 2 seconds earlier, our teammate receiving the pass could have received it comfortably, but because you held the ball for 1 to 2 seconds more, it turns into a situation where our teammate receives the ball while in a duel or under pressure from an opponent. You must be careful about this. Do not play grenade passes. 7. A precise kick, but too short. As a defensive midfielder, there are times when you need to switch play or hit a kick into the space behind the defense. At that time, which is better, a precise but slightly short kick, or a slightly longer kick that goes into the space behind the defense, even if the accuracy is a little lower. There is a condition that you must be able to hit a long kick, but if both are possible, then without question, the longer kick is better even if it is a little less accurate. The reason is that creating a situation where our attacker and the opponent's defender compete for the ball itself puts pressure on the opponent, and even if the probability is only 50-50, it is still a very favorable situation from the attacking side's perspective. But amateur football is not that simple. You have to look well and choose your kick for the older guys on your team, because if they look at it and think it is too long, they will not run. But in general, that is when the attacker and defender have similar pace, it is always better to put it over the defensive line. The worst situation is a kick that gets caught by a header on the defensive line. So please, if you decide to hit the kick, hit it firmly and get it over the defensive wall. 8. Receiving the ball with your back turned. Midfielders often have many situations where they receive the ball with their back to goal. At this time, when receiving the ball from the back line, receiving it with your back turned is not good. Still, when you quickly move toward a teammate to receive the ball, There are cases where you have no choice but to receive with your back turned. But in these cases, it is important to take even 1 or 2 steps to the side, left or right, and create space where you can open your body even a little more. But the reality of amateur football is not easy. Even if you make this kind of movement, the ball probably will not be played properly to your feet. If you miss this one timing, you get trapped and crowded out. And because that happens very frequently in amateur football, just accept it. Please encourage your teammates. Anyway, getting angry and frustrated on the pitch does not help this game at all. Instead, please recommend soccer tutorial videos and the how to get better at football EBOOK. Even when our team makes mistakes, not hurting our team's atmosphere, that too is part of a midfielder's role. And before receiving the ball, one thing I always heard while playing in midfield was that I should always keep my body half open, and I was always coached that way. What that means is, when receiving the ball from the center back, instead of just facing our own goal and receiving it, if you always keep your body half open, you can see both sides. Then, even if the ball comes to you, you can know when pressure is coming from the opponent. But if you stay closed like this, it is hard to see pressure coming from behind. But when receiving a ball coming from the center back, even if you just keep your body half open, when the ball comes to you, you can recognize that pressure is coming. Then you can spray it forward non-stop. But if your body itself is facing your own goal, then because of the opponent's pressure, it becomes difficult to take the ball. Turn your body and then play it forward. You keep the near side touchline behind you and look out toward the far side. Since I am positioned toward this wide side, I have options I can choose from. If the pass line is over there near me and my body is facing only that line, then there is only one of our attackers there, the winger near the line. But I need to open my body toward the wide side like this. Then I can pass to the attacking midfielder, or deeper to the striker, or switch it to the opposite side, and I need to open my body in that direction so I can think of more passing options. So it is better to receive with your body half open. It is even better if you keep the near side touchline behind you. 4. Must-have skills for a defensive midfielder. 1. The position where a defensive midfielder receives the ball. What a defensive midfielder or central midfielder must know is that, as you can see here, it is advantageous to receive the ball behind the opponent's pressing line. It may not seem like a big thing, but by understanding and applying this simple fact, you can escape the opponent's pressure, turn your body, and make better plays. On the other hand, as you can see here, if your receiving position is in front of the opponent's attackers, then everything you do is exposed as it is, so it becomes easy to collapse under pressure. But while watching this video, many of you may be thinking that our team's center backs cannot play that pass through the middle, like in this video. That is why, in amateur football, the stronger the team is, the more solid the defense tends to be. Because these kinds of passes often do not come through, in some teams there are cases where the defensive midfielder has to drop deeper into the defensive area to receive. I understand that. But no matter what, receiving the ball behind the line and between the opponent's attackers is still absolutely the right thing to do. Please be sure to remember this, because even if I, as the defensive midfielder, drop into a deeper area, in the case of a center back who is not good at build-up, there is a high chance that instead of moving or spreading to receive the ball again, he will just stand next to me. When you have 2 center backs and a back 4, there are cases where the defensive midfielder drops down and forms a back 3 to build up, and that is when the opponent has 2 attackers pressing. If the opponent sends 2 attackers, then it becomes 2 versus 2 against the center backs. Then you do not have numerical superiority. So if one defensive midfielder drops in a La Volpiana shape, it becomes a 3 versus 2 situation. Then it becomes easier for us to build up. But if the opponent has only 1 attacker, then there is no need for the defensive midfielder to drop down. If it is 2 center backs against 1 attacker, then the defensive midfielder should receive the ball in front of that, behind the opponent's attacker, and carry it forward. 2. Thinking in advance before receiving the ball. To play football well, your thinking speed must be fast, and you must plan your play in advance before receiving the ball. That is true for everyone. And if you are a defensive midfielder, it is even more true, because situations in football change moment by moment. You may have to adjust the first option of the play you had in mind into a second option while playing, but you must always have option 1 and option 2, or at least option 1 before the ball comes. To do that, this may sound obvious, but you have to keep checking what is around you over your shoulder before receiving the ball. You have to keep checking how close your marker is to you, whether he intends to get tight or whether he is planning to block the return pass you are trying to make. Setting your plan in advance before you have possession is almost the most important ability and skill required of a midfielder. No matter how urgent it is, you should at least know whether he is tight to you or not. This is something from a Busquets interview that I came across during my research. I am not fast, so my head brain has to be fast. I have to be there in advance and predict what is going to happen. It is about scanning, checking where everyone is, and knowing in advance before things happen. I really relate to Busquets' idea that the brain has to be fast. 3. Non-stop open pass. There are 2 know-how points for playing an open pass. The first is non-stop. Basically, this is an open pass hit without even looking, on the assumption that the opponent's defensive line is a little high, and on the assumption that you and our team's winger are on the same page and have good chemistry. For this pass, the winger needs to at least have in mind that I might hit it. Or, wingers who are good at striking the ball already know. And the reason this pass is almost bound to succeed is that, because the midfielder is playing the ball toward the side, you need to understand that unless there is an overwhelming speed difference between the winger and the opponent's fullback, the structure naturally favors the winger in that speed race. Because of these reasons and strengths, when the defensive line is high, playing the ball out toward the winger on the side can become a very good progression. There is one really important point here. It is that hitting it non-stop is the most powerful. In my opinion, the biggest difference between former players and non-player amateurs may be this technique of turning and bending the ball non-stop. Non-player amateurs tend to first control the ball and then try to do something. But I think this technique of bending and turning the ball in one motion is the ultimate way of releasing the ball along its natural path and keeping the flow of the move alive. But as I keep saying, the player who is going to receive it has to know that the ball is coming out at this timing for the effectiveness to become twice as great. From what I have felt after playing with teams of many different amateur levels, whether a player can predict this pass or not, in both defense and attack, has a considerable effect on the level of play. The second point is that when hitting to the right side, the left foot is advantageous, and when hitting to the left side, the right foot is advantageous. The reason is that the ball naturally bends outward, so it slightly increases the chance that our winger will keep possession of the ball. 4. Reading the opponent's mind. Reading the opponent's mind is exactly a skill that a midfielder must have. Reading the opponent's mind is the skill of reading the opponent's intentions. Football is ultimately a psychological game, so no matter how strong or fast a technique is, if you can predict it, you can stop it. In that sense, reading the opponent's mind is a very powerful skill. Reading the opponent's mind is mainly used against the opponent's build-up from the back, but in fact, it can be used in all situations in football, and if you master it well, you can upgrade your football ability by 1 level. To understand this skill, we need to analyze through what process we make decisions and play when we pass the ball. If you properly learn just this one skill through this video, you will get full value for the time you spent watching it. First, let's think about when I pass the ball. It is good to identify where to pass before receiving the ball, but sometimes that is impossible. And because the game situation changes, you look for where to pass after receiving the ball. After deciding where to pass, when you actually make the pass, you look at the ball. And then you pass. The key is this: you find where to pass, and then you kick while looking at the ball. In most cases, players pass the ball to the place they looked at last right before kicking it. That split-second moment is the secret. If you have a teammate who is good at reading passes, and he told you a different secret, he lied. This is the secret. However, if you predict too early, in other words, if you move before the opponent's eyes go to the ball, the opponent notices that you are moving to intercept by prediction. So if you move right after the opponent starts looking at the ball, the opponent cannot know that you moved by predicting it. Of course, more advanced players can use this mind-reading skill in reverse as well. Anyway, in amateur football, the probability is very, very high that the opponent will pass in the direction they looked last before making the pass. If you use this skill and intercept a pass, the interception itself is already a benefit, but there is another, more practical benefit. Once a player has had a pass intercepted, he cannot easily play passes into the midfielders during build-up from the back, because he feels pressure that the pass may be intercepted. Then in the end, the opponent's build-up has no choice but to go toward the sides or rely on long balls, and side build-up is easier to trap, while long balls have a high probability of losing possession. So in the end, the fact that you use this mind-reading skill itself is very burdensome for the opponent. Remember this: you need to know where the opponent looks last before passing. And when the opponent looks at the ball, move subtly and quickly, and go win the ball. Also, to use this skill cleverly, you can intentionally leave a good passing lane slightly open and then predict the timing when the opponent is about to pass and move to intercept. On the other hand, if I am the defensive midfielder and I want to deceive the opponent, it can be effective to deliberately look in a different direction from where I actually want to pass, and then pass the other way. Anyway, football is a psychological game. You have to keep thinking about these kinds of predictions constantly. I was also the type of player who won the ball a lot by predicting. So when I felt like the opponent was about to receive the ball, I do not think I stayed too tight to him. From what I remember, I stayed a little off on purpose, because if I stay right up tight, that guy, the passer, does not give the pass to this guy, the receiver, because I am too tight to him. Then if I stay a certain distance away, about 2 to 3 meters away, he is going to play the pass. And then at the exact timing when he plays it, I step in at that timing. 5. Balanced distribution and controlling the attacking tempo. What I felt while preparing this content on defensive midfielders is that there is a lot of overlap between the roles of a central midfielder and a defensive midfielder, and the differences are subtle, so it would be better to cover them together. What I am about to talk about now is closer to the role of a central midfielder. It is about controlling the attacking tempo. A midfielder has to play the role of controlling the tempo of the game according to the match situation. For example, you have to consider various factors, such as whether we are winning by a lot or losing, or whether our winger is tired because he just sprinted. Also, even if you are not fully confident in our wingback, if he is making an overlapping run after sprinting more than 40 meters, you should know how to give him the pass, and you should know how to express appreciation to the wingback who made that overlapping run. That is a virtue a midfielder should have. What everyone who plays football likes in the end is touching the ball a lot during the game. A midfielder should also think about whether there is anyone who has not touched the ball much during the game, and whether the kicks have been distributed evenly to the left and right. Because we are losing right now, when comparing the opponent's fullback and our winger, who has the higher probability of winning, and in which direction should we play the ball so that we can score one more goal more easily, and things like that. A midfielder should play while thinking about all of these things comprehensively. In the end, while seeing the whole game, you have to judge comprehensively the opponent's spacing, their weaknesses, our strengths, and the situation. If the spacing is wide, then into the midfield area where the spacing is wide. If the opponent's line is high, then into the space behind the defensive line, and so on. 6. Make the opponent's ace feel suffocated. Defensive midfielders often have to deal with the opponent's attacking midfielder. That player is usually technically good and highly likely to be the opponent's ace. And defensive midfielders play in areas that are relatively less dangerous than the back four line. And in football teams, the fighters are usually in defensive midfield and at fullback, and usually the psychological battle between both teams happens here. Back when I was at Suwon Samsung, when we played the super match against Seoul, at that time our coach told me to man-mark Molina for the full 90 minutes. I just followed him around, and whenever he got the ball, I hit him really hard. Basically with foul-level contact, even if it gets called as a foul, hit him hard, but not in a dangerously injuring way, really crash into him. After the contact, I would smile and say, sorry, help him up. And then the next time he got the ball, I would hit him like that again. That is how I remember it. And then the opponent players started getting angry. I kept making fouls, but I was smiling and apologizing, so because of that, I think there was even more contact later on. I remember there was some back and forth mind games too. If you do that, as time goes on, the opponent attacker cannot play his own game as well. Because he keeps getting hit, I think he had a lot of difficulty because of that. Against FC Seoul, I remember I did a good job man-marking Molina successfully. And when we played Jeonbuk at that time, there was a player named Luis, and I bothered him a lot, but he did not get shaken for the full 90 minutes. He did not care. Even if I hit him hard, he did not care. He just got right back up and did what he had to do, and I remember thinking, this guy is mentally really strong. I think it is different for every player. 7. Beating pressure. Among the representative skills of a defensive midfielder, you cannot leave out beating pressure, various types of turns, and ball keeping. Because defensive midfielders often receive the ball with their back to the opponent's goal. For detailed and more in-depth techniques for beating pressure and turning, if you refer to our channel's Beating the Press video, you will be able to see a lot of techniques. In this video, I will introduce the most representative beating the press and turning techniques that are especially useful for defensive midfielders. The first is the half turn. In my opinion, the half turn is the most important skill in football. As I say in every piece of content, the advantage of the half turn is that the foot you use to control the ball becomes your plant foot, so the timing of the pass is one beat faster and the movement is simple, and the key point is to receive while opening your body halfway or even more. The second is the drag turn. Drag turn is a turn name we arbitrarily gave it on our channel. From what I have observed, when Lee Kang-in receives the ball, I felt that he turns like this in more than 7 out of 10 cases. The advantage of the drag turn is that while turning and moving the ball, it also works as a moving first touch to escape pressure, and at the same time the ball does not get far away from your body. In other words, you turn while deceiving the opponent, but the ball stays under your feet. The third is moving first touch. Moving first touch is a technique where, when the ball is played into you and you expect strong pressure from the defender, you move away from your current spot with one touch. Moving first touch can be done in many ways, with the inside, outside, back foot, and so on, but the key is that it must break the opponent's prediction, and the ball must not get too far away while you move. Lastly, I will add one useful tip I learned during the research for this content. Xavi said in an interview with a Spanish media outlet, "I use the fixed elements of the pitch to understand my position." The elements he mentioned included the lines, the goal, and the referee. The referee stays in a neutral space where he does not interfere with play, but can always see the flow of the ball best. Players like Xavi or Busquets use the referee's position as a reference point and intuitively judge, that is a channel where defenders are not crowded. In a chaotic situation where you are trying to beat pressure, the referee's position can mean that the pressure is likely to be looser there. I think it is a very convincing idea. 8. Winning loose scramble balls. A two-deck ball refers to those moments when the ball pops up and becomes nobody's ball after we lose it in attack, or after the opponent loses it in attack, and both sides are scrambling for it. These loose scramble ball situations happen especially often in the midfield area. At that time, it is important to keep possession going by giving it non-stop to a safe teammate, even if it has to be played in the air. It is important to exchange it a few times non-stop, so that our team can keep stable possession and bring it back under control at our feet. If it were deep in the back four area, it might be a ball you would clear, but in the midfield area, in most cases it is better to keep the ball alive and keep possession. 9. Diagonal build-up. Basically, if the ball comes out from the right back, there are many opponent defenders on the right side. If it comes out from the left back, then of course there will be many defenders on the left side. That is natural for any normal football team. Even in amateur football, it is natural, like iron filings being pulled by a magnet toward the ball. So the basic principle of build-up direction is naturally this. If the ball comes out from the right back, it should go to our left winger. And if it comes out from the left back, it should go to our right winger. That would be theoretically ideal. Of course, if the forward is not marked, then you can play it to the forward, or if our winger's movement is not good, or depending on the opponent defender's positions, then naturally it can be different. Anyway, if you play in midfield, the most basic thing you should think about is this diagonal type build-up I just mentioned. Please do not go around using the term diagonal build-up. We just made up that term while preparing this content. When doing this diagonal build-up, the condition for a game-changing killer pass is when the opponent's defensive line is high and the winger on the opposite diagonal has pulled wide enough to receive.
근데 저기 축구에서 이 윙이 안 돼 있더라, 이게 준비가 대부분.
10. Heading against goal kicks. When the opponent takes a goal kick, it usually has to be dealt with by the defensive midfielder. If there is a defensive midfielder who keeps winning headers after contesting 2 or 3 aerial duels, that itself becomes a powerful weapon for our team. Especially if one header can clear the ball far beyond the opponent's defensive line, or if a precise header can keep possession for our team, it becomes really powerful. Even then, if the opponent team keeps hitting goal kicks or long kicks from the defensive area, then the opponent team is being foolish. Being good at heading involves many factors such as reading the dropping point, timing, height, jumping ability, courage, and so on. But in the end, you usually know after competing 2 times or so. From the opponent's point of view, they lose one option, so it becomes frustrating. But one thing I feel is that, because the mindset toward football matches is different between your player days and amateur football. In amateur football, people do not seem to attack goal kick balls with direct headers as if they are going to crack their heads open. Anyway, it is definitely true that a defensive midfielder being good at headers in our defensive area is a big merit. To give a brief tip on heading, reading the dropping point is the most important thing. And at the very least, if you are a defensive midfielder, it is good to have enough fighting spirit and heading ability to at least disrupt the opponent's header. Additionally, we also have a video on our channel about how to head well, so please check that out. Outro. Today we took a detailed look at how to play well as a defensive midfielder. How was it? Now, at least in your head, you fully understand how you should think and how you should move in defensive midfield, right? As I always say, understanding it in your head and actually executing it are completely different things. Practice is the only way. If you need practice, the method is in the pinned comment link below. Please check it out. I will continue to do my best to become a channel that explains football in overwhelmingly detailed ways. Usually in amateur football, the wingers are often not ready. Once you get to around the level of more advanced high school players, when a center back takes a goal kick, they switch positions with the defensive midfielder. Basically, when it looks like a goal kick is coming, they set it up in advance. And if we are pressing and need to win the header, usually center backs are good at heading, right? So the center back steps up a little and wins the header, and I, the defensive midfielder, drop off a little behind him. So if the defensive midfielder is tall and is the type who can be a target, that is a big advantage. Rather than saying one is better or worse, I think it depends on the quality of the player making the pass. There are players who can hit it well with the right foot, and that may be more comfortable for them. On the other hand, if you want to hit it to the right side, and you bend it with the left foot using the instep so it curls outward, then the ball is not going to go out, right? If you play it into space, you know what I mean, right? Right. If you hit it like that with the left foot, depending on how you hit it, it could go out, or the winger out wide here could control it. But if you bend and hit it like this with the left foot, it is not going to go out on the outside, right? If you play it into space, I think there are pros and cons like that, and I do not think there is a clear absolute right or wrong. Even if I am more comfortable with my right foot, if the situation itself is such that the defender is positioned on this side, there can be situations where I turn my body like this and hit it with my left foot,